Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Keep Illinois webinar, in which we're going to go over our Defining Educator Compensation Study. This webinar will be joined by the full report that we'll be releasing a few days from now as we record the webinar, and it will be included in our newsletter on Friday, May 7th, 2026. We will also update the description here in the YouTube video and include the link to the full study after it has been published this Friday. So with that said, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And if you have questions, we'll take those at the end today. So my name is Jason Klein. I'm the Senior Director of Learning Partnerships here at Northern Illinois University. As part of my role, I'm lucky enough to facilitate the Illinois P20 network. I was joined on this study by Doctors Kelly Summers and Benjamin Creed. They are both professors, assistant professors in our Leadership, Educational Psychology, and Foundations Department in our College of Education. And we did this work together as part of the NIU P20 Research and Data Collaborative. So we're really excited to have this joint effort between the Illinois P20 Network and the College of Education as part of our P20 Research and Data Collaborative, and to help continue to inform the work that people from across the state have undertaken through our P20 Network's Keep Illinois initiative. So a couple of years ago, nearly a couple of years ago, we released a literature review as a result of the work of Keep Illinois participants, and that report was called The Road to Retention. We'll also have that linked in the description of the video. And from that report, there were 4 recommendations that we felt that the research suggested. The first of those was to support compensation for educators as an effort to increase retention. Other strategies for increasing retention were teacher leadership, professional development, instructional coaching, and co-teaching, and then the culture, working conditions, and wellness of school districts and other organizations in which educators work. So things like special education cooperatives, etc. So with that all said, based on these 4 recommendations, we looked at the landscape of what the Illinois P20 network was already doing, as well as what other organizations in the state were doing. And the 2 areas that stuck out as being most in need of ongoing research and support were compensation and then culture, working conditions, and wellness. And originally, we endeavored to engage in a study that looked at both those areas, but as we began the development process for this study, we zeroed in on compensation. And that is what we're going to talk about today, is compensation, and remembering that what we're studying here is compensation as one driver potentially of educator retention. Now, our study of compensation took a little bit of a different angle, and we decided to study not how much money people make. That data is available. We could have asked ISB for that data. There's publicly available data for each school district in the state on the report card in average teacher salary and average administrator salary. But instead, we said, what does compensation mean to educators? If we're going to do this research, let's take a step back and try and understand that, because, of course, compensation, as any chief school business official or assistant superintendent for human resources will tell us, or frankly, anybody, school board member, union leader that's on a collective bargaining team would tell us, there is a lot more dollars being spent as part of our overall compensation package on things like health insurance and dental and disability, our TRS contributions or our IMRF contributions, depending on one's role in an organization. So that's what we were here to look at. So with that said, the methodology that we employed, this was a survey study, and this was an original survey that we created. It was tested internally at NIU and with the field, testing particularly focused on survey clarity, as well as time to completion. We also engaged with a number of key communication partners to help get the survey out. Those partners included the Illinois State Board of Education, a wide range of statewide professional organizations. Their help was invaluable on sharing out the survey, and the partnership with the Illinois Education Association, which highlighted the survey directly with its members across Illinois. One of the difficult sets of decisions we made in developing the survey was to really err on the side of focusing on anonymity, knowing the wide range of school districts in Illinois with hundreds of small districts. We really wanted to ensure that not only would participants in the survey be anonymous, but that they would feel like they were anonymous. So as a result of that, there were some key questions that we chose not to include. We didn't ask participants if they were a TRS or an IMRF employee. To some degree, we can make assumptions about that based on one's self-reported position, but not entirely. For example, there are administrators that are IMRF administrators in operational areas of school district work, for example. We also did not ask whether people were tier 1 or tier 2. And again, while we did ask about their years of experience in Illinois and in their current school district, we can't just make assumptions based on that, unfortunately. And again, we chose not to ask this to preserve anonymity. And then we also chose not to ask about a variety of demographic fields that you would normally ask respondents about. But in this case, we felt like it would preserve anonymity and while would be very interesting and potentially very important in helping further understand how different educators define compensation differently, we decided to hold off on this case. What we did include, and this was optional, you did not need to respond to this, was the identification of your school district. And when people did select their school district, that, and we were clear about this in the survey, that was going to allow us to then pull in publicly available data from the Illinois School Report Card and be able to potentially look at factors across districts. Finally, once we had all the data and we're beginning to initially understand what was in the data, we created some fields that did not end up being quite as critical for the research as we had envisioned when we created them, but might be useful for future research. The first was we created this administrator to teacher salary ratio that could be very helpful when looking at issues around compensation. For that, we simply use the ISB publicly reported data for those fields, the average administrator salary and the average teacher salary. There would be more nuanced ways to look at that if conducting this research specifically on that locally. Again, that field did not end up being something that we utilized, but we wanted to call it out as part of our process of working through the survey data. We also looked at the available fields for district geographic location and district size that were in use in the state of Illinois. And we felt like for this study, the existing fields were not, kind of didn't hit that Goldilocks just right measure. So we created some new fields for those, and we won't go into great detail on those here, but we'll briefly touch on them in this webinar. So let's look at who responded to the survey. And the survey was given last spring, a year ago at this time, and that was a very intentional time frame. And so in terms of who responded, at the end of the day, after we had cleaned the data, we had over 1,300 usable responses. Of those 1,300 usable responses, 103 were non-licensed educators. They did not have a Pell or a professional educator license. There were over 1,200 with a Pell, and of those 1,200, the vast majority were classroom teachers. of all different kinds, but we also had 186 administrators and 244 non-classroom, non-administrator Pell holders. So those folks are people like school psychologists, school social workers, speech language pathologists, librarians, instructional coaches. All of those positions would fall in that category of 204 individuals who responded with a Pell, but who are not in a classroom role right now. We did ask people about their highest post-secondary degree. That becomes pretty important, oftentimes in people's actual compensation. And we had a lot of respondents who had graduate degrees, including multiple graduate degrees and even a number with doctoral degrees. And so this does skew to the right a bit as you're looking at this graph in terms of who our respondents were and the percentage of them that had advanced degrees. The years of experience in Illinois, pretty wide range of years of experience. We can see the bell-shaped curve here. We've got quite a mix from early career educators to experienced educators, with the bulk of the respondents having somewhere between 5 and 30 years of experience, so being in the middle of their careers. The years of experience in the current district shifted significantly from how much experience they had in Illinois. And so one of the things that tells us is this speaks to some mobility among respondents of moving districts. And so what we don't really have is how that compares to the population of educators statewide, but it's interesting to note, and probably important to note, that people who have responded to this survey have been in their current districts less years than they've been working in Illinois, which suggests they've been working in other districts in Illinois previously. So in terms of districts, 972 of the 1,311 respondents did identify their district, and there were 228 districts that were identified. So about a fourth of Illinois school districts were identified. Now, how many people from each district participated? Well, there was a very wide range, from as few as 1 respondent to as high as 82 respondents from a single district. It's important to note 130 of the districts, or more than half of the identified districts, only had 1 response. So we're going to be cautious about drawing conclusions about districts from this, just like we're going to be cautious about drawing conclusions about the whole population of educators in Illinois, given that there was less than 1% of educators who responded to the survey, even despite the significant outreach efforts statewide over a 2-month window last spring with some really high-profile organizations. So where were the districts that did respond? Well, here we can see on this slide, we do have a good mix of Illinois districts here. So on the right side, from very small to very large, we have districts across that continuum. And frankly, and this is in the written report, we'll see if I get the numbers exactly right as I'm doing this off the top of my head. But I think our smallest district represented had 146 students, and our largest district represented had hundreds of thousands of students. And so we had quite a range. We also had quite a range geographically. And while we've reported here in the raw numbers, one of the things to remember is the numbers of districts in some of these regions are much smaller than the numbers of districts in other regions. So again, we had a real wide mix. Another factor to consider when thinking about district numbers is which regions have a mix of elementary and high school districts, where you'll often have anywhere from 2 to 10 districts that would make up a single unit school district that goes from pre-K through 12th grade. And so that also skews how many districts there are in each of these regions, but pretty diverse representation of school districts that match the range of districts that exist across the state of Illinois. We were quite pleased with that. So I've said some of these things already, but just to summarize who our study participants were, pretty high degree attainment, lots of people taking this survey with at least a master's degree, and in many cases, multiple graduate degrees or certificates. We've got some evidence here that the participants who responded to the survey have more mobility because they've been in their current districts for fewer years than they've worked in Illinois. We have strong diversity of districts that was represented in this survey. And again, we do need to remember that while in a lot of ways this population of respondents or the sample of respondents represented the population of the state, it's a very small percentage of the overall population of Illinois educators. So we want to take some caution in drawing conclusions, but we still think this study provides a great landscape analysis and foundation for additional research work that can be very, very important, particularly in a world in which we need to use our resources, our limited resources, as effectively as possible. So what do educators think of their compensation? Well, educators across all types of educators and everybody, all 1,300 people plus who responded, we see there's a wide range of answers to whether they view compensation as take-home pay, total pay, versions of total pay, and how that plays out. A large percentage do view take-home pay as being their view of compensation versus total pay, which would include insurance, other kinds of benefits, including things like tuition reimbursement, etc. So now we're going to break it down and look at it through a few different lenses. The first we're going to look is by job type here. So non-licensed educators' views. So typically these would be paraprofessionals. We see a higher percentage here viewing their compensation as being rooted deeply in take-home pay. When we look at teachers and other not administrators who have a professional educator's license, we see a similar pattern with it being deeply rooted in take-home pay. When we move to administrators, we see it shift. And the shift here is to total pay plus all other benefits. Now, we have some thoughts and ideas about that, but they're just thoughts and ideas. And so again, this is what we know from the research we conducted here. We definitely think, as we'll talk about at the end of the webinar, there's room for further study here now that this study can direct us towards pretty specifically. Now we're going to look across the years of experience. And this is the years of experience teaching in Illinois, not just the years of experience in their current district. And so here, for our less experienced teachers and other educators, we can see again, take-home pay, the multiple categories that call it take-home pay, the majority of responses fall into those categories. As we move through the years of experience, we see that pattern continues to hold through 5 to 10 years of experience, 11 to 20 years of experience. And then once we get beyond 20 years of experience, we see it shift. And this is not the only time we will see that shift happen like that. And now total pay starts to take precedence. And by the time we look at our most experienced educators, who are also typically our most highly paid educators, total pay becomes the priority in terms of how they define compensation. So we've got a number of key takeaways, and when you see the written report when it's released on Friday, you'll be able to drill in and read these right off the bat in the executive summary. We're going to call each of them out here and provide some supporting data for each key takeaway. Some of this will get a little redundant because the same data points to multiple takeaways. So the first takeaway, unsurprisingly, educators want to be paid more. So some of the data that pointed us to this key takeaway is that all respondents' feelings about whether or not they're well compensated, we've got quite the bell curve here, and it really distributes across a very normal curve here. But it does skew a little bit to the right when we look at all respondents. Now, the story starts to look different when we look at it by job type. For example, none of our non-licensed educators who responded said that they were compensated very well, and only a handful said that they were compensated well, whereas a large percentage, the majority, by far, said they were compensated either not well, poorly, or very poorly. When we look at teachers, the curve evens out a little bit, but it still skews to the right a little bit but it's pretty even. And again, there's a lot of potential research here that could be done as a follow-up, looking in more detail, different types of teaching roles, the grade level the educators are working in the geographic regions. And that was the kind of work we had wanted to do with the geographic regions, but we feel like we need more data from more districts to be able to do that effectively. So we point to additional work that can be done now in this direction. And then when we look at administrators, we see the polar opposite of the feelings that the paraprofessionals had in terms of their feelings about their compensation, with the majority feeling like they are being paid adequately, well, or even very well. Years of experience tells a similar story. Now, this is a more condensed data graph to look at, but the navy blue bars on the left of each cluster are the 1 to 4 years of experience, and the purple bars on the right of each cluster are 31 or more years of experience. And if you start to look across the colors, you see a shift, though the pattern is fairly similar across years of experience. There is a noticeable shift that we see as people have significantly more experience from their counterparts who are in the early or the middle parts of their career. Now, when we look across all three job types, still the most frequent response among respondents from each job category is the area of compensation they would like to see improved is additional salary as take-home pay. So that is loud and clear. That is a consistent message here. And that's part of all of this together is how we come up with the key takeaway that educators would like to be paid more. Our next takeaway is this one. For early and mid-career educators with less than 20 years of experience, increasing take-home pay in their paychecks is their most important compensation priority. And we see some of that evidenced here. Again, these are things we've looked at already. Our newest educators are telling us, our educators with the least experience are telling us take-home pay is most important. And we see that consistently being true until we have 20 years of experience. Similarly, when we asked about their ability to save, one of the things that we have found is educators with less than 20 years of experience have less of an ability to save. They are pretty consistent in answering that question. And so that's not only our 1st through 4th year teachers or our 5th through 10th year teachers, that also gets into our teachers who've been in the profession for a while. And we see it here on questions around living. You do or you can live in the district. We've got a pretty high percentage all the way across. But when we look at home ownership on the right side of the graph, over half of the respondents have essentially told us that home ownership is a real challenge until we get to that most experienced category of educators, 31 or more years. And even there, it's only 55.6% that's saying they own or can own a home in the district like that. And so there's, if home ownership is one of those bellwether figures for a solidly middle class experience in the United States of America, we're seeing that being a trailing factor here for many educators. As we've just seen from our data on our 1 to 4 year, our 5 to 10 year, and even our 11 to 20 year educators having challenges and seeking take-home pay additionally as the antidote to those challenges, we can see here that for later career educators with more than 20 years of experience, as well as for administrators, improving overall compensation is their most important compensation priority. So they're not just looking at take-home pay. And so this is another key takeaway. And we see that here where once you're beyond that 20 years, while take-home pay still has a very high percentage, there are increasing percentages of educators that responded to the survey saying, hey, total pay is really important to us. And when we get to 31 plus years of experience, all of those other views of compensation holistically definitely take root. With administrators, we looked at this already. We see that administrators feel like they are well compensated. And when we see the ability to save, we again see that our most experienced educators have a much greater ability to save, according to their own self-reporting, than do newer educators who responded to this survey. We looked at that home ownership data according to years of experience as well. For non-licensed educators, primarily paraprofessionals, increased take-home pay was, again, their most critical compensation priority. We've already seen this in the data. They don't feel like they're being well compensated. We look specifically at the ability to save by job type, and we see the non-licensed on the left side of this graph. There are almost no one who is able or easily able to save, whereas with administrators, there's a large chunk that are able and easily able to save. And with teachers and other non-administrator Pell licensed staff, we see a not quite a normal distribution curve, as there's not many who are easily able to save, but more of a normal distribution to the data. This is another interesting factor. When we look at other employment, we asked about who has another job outside of their work for their school district during summer, and who has another job outside their work for their school district during the school year. And unsurprisingly, a large percentage of our paraprofessionals, 57.3% who responded, said they are working during the summer in another job. And over a third of them, 35%, are working another job during the school year. What is interesting is those numbers were not far off the numbers of teachers. Now, one of the things that we did not ask about that, again, would be worthy of additional study is, what are these other jobs? Which of these other jobs are different people doing that are additive to their current job as a school district employee, and which are completely unrelated or maybe even subtractive to their school district employment? So for example, if administrators are teaching coursework for universities, that may be very additive. They're growing as learners. They may even be finding employees, future employees to hire through that process. Versus if I'm working another job for a delivery company or in a warehouse setting and very tired 3 nights a week and 1 day on the weekends, it's hard to physically recover as a paraprofessional who may also have a very physically taxing job at school working with students each day. And so that would be an example of a job that's subtractive. We didn't go there in this study, but we think this data raises some questions that are worthwhile for future study. Homeownership story here for non-licensed paraprofessional staff. Very few saying they own or can own a home. very few. And so that's important to call out. And again, leads us towards this key takeaway that significant increases to take-home pay are what they're looking for. Then this key takeaway, the time to retirement for Tier 2 educators is overwhelmingly considered problematic. Now, remember, we did not ask respondents, are you a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 educator? But we found that everybody gave us the same response regardless here. So we asked about the time to retirement for Tier 1 educators. What were respondents to the survey's feelings about that? And we see, again, a very, very normal distribution. Like, we almost could not have made a more normal distribution here, from outstanding to terrible. And we did allow for the I don't know for people who may not have know about what that looks like for Tier 1. But we contrast this when we flip over to the next slide, and we asked about the time to retirement for Tier 2 educators in Illinois. And overwhelmingly, across experience, across job type, there is a very significant feeling that it is either not so good or frankly terrible. And so that was pronounced here. So in terms of policy considerations, we've got some state level thoughts that are just the initial formation of thoughts. They are not anywhere near ready for some kind of legislation or policy action. There is a lot of work to be done by a lot of stakeholders, by a lot of researchers before these thoughts can be formed into policy considerations. And then we've actually got some thoughts that are a little more well-formed in terms of process of what school districts can do to use this information for their own collective bargaining and compensation decisions. So first at the state level, increasing take-home pay is, I mean, there's a clear call for that here. We see it in 2 of these 3 bullets. And so a couple of ideas there. One is a call to action for economists, public finance experts to put their heads together and say, what are some creative ways that we could increase take-home pay without maybe significantly increasing or possibly increasing at all the resources that are available for educator compensation? That's the real magic, right? And again, similarly, a question of a policy consideration. Should there be increased take-home pay that targets additional funding for early career educators to help keep them in the profession until their funding gets to a certain level? To some degree, the legislation from a few years ago to set a statewide minimum salary did do this. Likewise, there could be targeted funding to support specialized areas of educators, areas that the shortage is particularly averse and that there's great need in school districts. So early childhood, special education, bilingual ESL, career and technical education would tend to be the areas that would be foremost among the educator areas for further conversation. And then one of the areas we explored briefly, but think may have some potential, and again, requires a lot of additional effort, additional research and analysis, certainly stakeholder engagement. It's not ready for prime time now, though there have been some efforts in the last few years to move in this direction is to find ways to better support the efficient use of existing resources. So supporting insurance cooperative school districts have moved to insurance cooperatives significantly over many, many years. And that is very common now. Allowing districts to participate in statewide, state of Illinois insurance, or other solutions that might lower school district insurance expenditures. I mean, we're recording this the week after the Illinois Association of School Business Officials held their annual conference in Peoria this year. And it was not uncommon in the hallways and the lobbies to hear school business leaders from across the state say to each other, how much is your health insurance going up next year? And numbers were often around 15%, but numbers 19 and 20% were not unheard of in those conversations. And so looking at where maybe those insurance costs can be lowered and capped, and supporting school districts with that could allow some of that money to certainly go towards additional compensation in the form of take-home pay or towards other district needs as well. Now, for local actions, again, we focus more on process that we learned from this. And so one of the things we're suggesting is beginning with local data collection. So we've asked here statewide, hey, educators, what compensation is important to you? And we've seen some patterns, but there's no reason a district locally couldn't 6 months before, 4 months before collective bargaining begins, conduct the same research locally and do it collaboratively where administrators, union leaders, and even board members are all analyzing that data together. In the written report, in the appendix, we have a version of the survey that could be given as a local survey to understand your local stakeholders' compensation definitions. And then instead of just doing what you've always done, if there are some changes based on the needs of your school district, for example, if you have a large group of retirees or soon to be retirees, excuse me, you might negotiate the contract differently than the contract after that, which will likely have a large group of first through fourth year teachers. We see that statewide there's some different needs based on this research. You can find out locally if that's true. And so then once you've got that data, being really creative and finding ways to meet different employees' needs. We think that both IEA and IFT, along with IASPA and IASBO, can be real leaders as districts find creative solutions that work for them to help share out those solutions with both administrators and with union leaders, as well as then through IASB with school board members across the state. And then again, one of the things that will probably come out based on this data in local data is how do we prioritize increasing take-home pay for less experienced employees and non-licensed employees. So further research opportunities, there's a lot here. If you are thinking you're going to pursue a degree, graduate degree, a doctoral degree in particular, you've got some stuff at the end of this report that you can certainly peruse and consider as potential research opportunities. So everything from student loan debt, we asked some questions about that we didn't share here, and home ownership, to educators' budgeting and spending habits are all interesting topics for further research. Studying educators receive money to lead co-curricular activities and to provide supervision in many, if not most, school districts. How does that money impact their individual lives as individual educators, and how does it impact school district budgets overall? Further study around employment outside of the school district. We've talked about that. Tier 2, TRS, IMRF. Another interesting topic is we know that career and technical education teachers are one of our areas of shortage, and pay retirement retention can look different when you're coming from a job where maybe you were making $80,000 to $100,000 a year, and now you're going to make $45,000 a year, and you're a new teacher, and so it's hard, and it might be attractive to go back to making $90,000 a year in that profession instead of teaching about that profession. So lots of topics here for future research. Finally, we really appreciate you joining us and being with us to learn about this. Again, we will be releasing the study itself this Friday in our newsletter, and it will be on our website, and we'll add the link here to the YouTube video. So thank you so much for joining.